Hi and welcome to this Prime webinar. My name is Noah Cohen, and for this webinar I'm going to be talking about the wizards that have been built to support the Prime process. There are just a few points that I'm looking at covering as part of this webinar. First of all, I'll talk at a high level about the two different wizards that have been built to support the Prime process, and then I'll be going into the Prime and XPLAN screens to actually have a look at what both the Prime Fact Find and the Prime Advice wizard actually look like. As an overview, as I mentioned already, there have been two XPLAN wizards that have been built into the Prime process, and that is the Prime Fact Find and the Prime Advice wizard. Both of those wizards are ones that you need to use in order to have complete and compliant fact find documents as well as SOAs. The Prime Fact Find comes before you start using Prime with a client, and that's to record the initial information about that client. If you're not used to using Prime at the moment, it's a very similar set of questions as to the draft online fact find within XPLAN as well, and I'll talk about some of the differences as we go along. But it is a required step, and you should be doing that prior to going through the Prime process. Then at the tail end of the Prime process is the Prime Advice wizard. So that's completed after entering the Prime strategy and product recommendations. Basically, you've done everything that you need to inside Prime other than generating the statement of advice, and then you jump into the Prime Advice wizard to record the additional information about the recommendations and also the rationale as to why you're making those recommendations before generating the SOA itself. And again, the Prime Advice wizard as well as the Prime Fact Find are both required for a complete and compliant statement of advice. Now I'll go ahead and jump into the XPLAN screens for the rest of the webinar here. So here we are in XPLAN, and you can see I've got a client open at the moment, and the Prime Fact Find is located just under the Draft Online Fact Find, and I'll go ahead and jump into there. Again, if you are familiar with the Draft Online Fact Find, then the Prime Fact Find is going to be very similar. It's got the standard sorts of questions where you can confirm what areas are relevant to the fact find, and that'll determine what other pages show up throughout the rest of the process. Also, there's a social security information screen that you do need to confirm that the social security advice that you're looking to provide is advice that's actually supported inside Prime. And then as soon as you click on Next, the subsequent pages, as I mentioned, are going to be determined based on the fact find scope areas that you just selected above, and you need to progress through the different screens here to confirm all the details. All of these are available for editing, so if it's a brand new client, then you can enter the information from scratch here. If it's a client that you've seen before or recorded information for before, if you've recorded that information, say in the Draft Online Fact Find previously, the Prime Fact Find does use the same underlying fields, so whatever information you've already recorded about the client will automatically come across here. So it's certainly a good idea to review each of the pages to make sure it's complete, but you won't need to re-enter or re-key information that you've already recorded about the client in XPLAN previously. One key difference between the Prime Fact Find versus the Draft Online Fact Find is that there's nowhere that you record objectives and goals within the Prime Fact Find. The reason for that is that as part of the Prime process, you do actually need to record both objectives and goals in a very specific way within Prime itself, within the discovery screen. And because of that, if I jump down to the question of why the client sought advice, you can see you can record the details as to why the client actually did come to see you, and that should be in their own words. And you can see in my comments in the joint area, free from your influence, and you should be doing that before the specific goals and objectives are recorded inside Prime. So this is the opportunity to capture in the client's words what they're looking for, and then when you get to Prime, you need to translate that into the overarching objectives and then the specific and measurable goals underlying each one of those objectives, so that you can actually use Prime to measure how on track or otherwise the clients are towards reaching their goals and objectives. So as part of the process, you need to go through each one of the pages that still appears based on what you've selected back in the fact find scope. Once you get to the end of the process, you can choose any additional documentation you'd like to include within the fact find document itself. And if I click on Next, so I'm at the bottom page of the Prime Fact Find, if I click on Next after there, that gives me the option of generating the fact find, or going through the same process again, or going back to the main client details. And the key thing that I want to call out here is the option to merge fact find. So whether you're generating essentially a blank fact find, if you've just got, say, the client's name, you can go straight to the end of the Prime Fact Find wizard and generate the fact find here. It'll populate with whatever information is in XPLAN about the client already, which again may just be the client's name, and you could use that essentially blank fact find to capture the other bits and pieces of information that you need as part of the fact-finding meeting. Alternatively, if you do have a lot of information recorded about the client, then you can still use that merge fact find button. It'll be a much more comprehensive reverse fact find in those circumstances. And then you can fill in whatever gaps are still remaining or whatever's changed since you met with the client last. So that's the easiest and most efficient way to get the fact find information and all the information you've got stored about the client. And again, going through that Prime fact find process is a required step for going through the Prime end-to-end process as well. From there, you can then go into the Prime screens, and that'll open up as a new tab. And the discovery screen that I've jumped to here, I just want to call out the fact that the information that you've recorded about the income, expenses, assets, and liabilities of the client, including protection and superannuation assets, all shows up automatically. So provided that you have recorded the information first within the Prime fact find, you've got the information presented in a very easy to read and digestible way, and the discovery screen is something that you can use in front of the client to engage with them. And you can see that the big box in the middle of the screen is the objectives, and then any in-scope objectives have the link to record the underlying goals. So that is the place to fill in that last missing piece within the Prime fact find to round out the objectives and goals. I won't spend any more time in the Prime screens any longer because I do want to focus on the wizards side of things for this webinar. To get to the Prime advice wizard, that's at the very end of the process. So you go to the advice summary page. Once that's loaded up, down on the statement of advice option, before you generate the statement of advice itself, you need to launch the Prime advice wizard. So clicking in there, it takes me into a screen that I can also access directly from XPLAN itself. Any scenarios you've already created will show up in the list, or you can create new scenarios here. The key call out that I want to make is that if you're creating a scenario from scratch here, make sure that you link it to the same case that you're dealing with inside Prime. The SOA is going to look to both Prime and also the Prime advice wizard to populate the relevant bits and pieces. And if both of those things are not linked to the same case, then the information in the SOA isn't going to make sense. So it is important to link it to the same case you've been going through inside Prime. In my case, I've already got a couple different ones that I've already started, so I can go into one of those scenarios, click into it, and it takes me into the subsequent pages. Now I'll just show you how to access that through XPLAN itself. So if I go back from the fact find document, I'll go to view, edit the entity details. And down the very bottom is the Prime wizard, and that's exactly the same screen that you can access from within Prime when you click on the Prime advice wizard button. So either way is fine, they both work in exactly the same way. The introduction page is similar to the first page of the Prime fact find, in that the options that you select here are going to determine what other pages appear as part of the Prime wizard process. So choose whatever's applicable. One of the nice things of the wizard is that with a lot of the questions that show up, they've also got information tips that you can just hover over or click on the I buttons, and it'll give you a bit more information about what's being asked for or what you need to record in each one of those questions. So choose whatever's relevant as you go through the process. As you go through the process, you can fill in the extra bits and pieces. I won't go through every single one of these pages, but what I do really want to call out is the objectives side of things. Now, within this particular piece of advice, I've got a total of 3 objectives that have been recorded against the client, but only 2 of them are in scope. So you can see I've got protection, retirement, and savings and investment. Those are all of my objectives. And then the ones that show up the top of the screen are those that are in scope. And it is important that you edit both in-scope and out-of-scope objectives from this screen, and all of that extra information is going to flow across into the statement of advice. So for the in-scope objectives, I can click on the pencil button next to them. In this case, it was my protection objective. For each of those in-scope objectives, you need to record what their position would be without the advice, and also details of any trade-off discussions. You don't need to worry about any of the other tabs or any of the information up the top. You just need to focus on that summary of position tab to record those extra bits and pieces. For the out-of-scope objectives, if I scroll down, I've got my savings and investment objective, which is out of scope. If I click on the pencil button here, I've got the out-of-scope commentary showing up, and you can record why you're not providing the advice, things that the client should consider, and when you're planning on actually addressing that particular objective. So both of those areas need to be reviewed. You do need to be a little bit careful about what you're reviewing where, because say if I review an in-scope objective in the lower section of the screen, I do get the same options to record the out-of-scope commentary, but given that this is an in-scope objective, it's not actually relevant. So again, make sure you record additional information for the in-scope objectives at the top and additional information for the out-of-scope objectives down the bottom. And then finally, this last section is easy to miss. If you are giving insurance advice and you've got some insurance covers or clients that are out of scope, this is the section that you need to record that in. That gets set back in the introduction. So one of the questions in the introduction page is there out of scope insurance? If you say yes to that, then this question down the bottom of the objectives page will show up, and you do need to make sure to fill that information in. Now I'll scroll back up to the top of the page. You can see there are a number of other pages to review. I'll call out the fees and costs. So even if you have recorded the details of the fees and costs back in Prime to be picked up within the projections, you still need to record that information in here because this is what's determining what flows across into the statement of advice. Also the other pages, so superannuation, investments and protection, make sure you're reviewing all those details, ticking and confirming whatever information is being asked for, because again all that information is required for a compliant statement of advice, and the information that you've recorded in Prime by itself is not going to be enough for that complete piece of advice. Then finally there's the disclosures page. Answer the questions as you need to, and then when you click on next, that just confirms that's the end of the wizard. Unlike the Prime fact find, there's no button to click to generate an additional document. All of this just flows across into the statement of advice and nowhere else. So there's nothing else you need to do within this window. Don't click on the X for the browser itself, but click on the X within the Prime Advice wizard. That'll close out of this sub-screen and take us back into Prime. And then from here you can generate the statement of advice. And once again, that will be drawing information from the Prime fact find, all of the screens you've completed inside Prime itself, and then also the Prime Advice wizard. That's everything that I wanted to talk about as part of this webinar. So thanks for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you in the next webinar.